Hello, and welcome to Conversations in Culture and Evolution. I am your host, Carles Salazar, and I am talking to you from Lleida in Catalonia. Conversations in Culture and Evolution is a product of a work group of the Catalan Institute of Anthropology that goes by the name of Culture, Cognition, and Evolution. And in this group, we are some anthropologists and archaeologists and happy with the way in which our disciplines were treating Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection and the relationship between biology and culture in the explanation of human behavior. And in order to compensate for this deficiency, or what we understand as a deficiency, we have created this group. Now, today, we have a very special guest. We are really privileged and honored to have as our guest Professor Robin Dunbar from Oxford University. Hello, Robin.
Hello, great pleasure to be with you.
Welcome to Conversations in Culture and Evolution. Now, Professor Dunbar is Emeritus Professor of Evolutionary Psychology at the University of Oxford and ERC Advanced Investigator. Professor Dunbar's research is concerned with trying to understand the behavioral, cognitive, and neuroendocrinological mechanisms that underpin social bonding in primates in general and humans in particular. Understanding these mechanisms and the functions that relationships serve will give us insights how humans have managed to create large-scale societies using a form of psychology that is evolutionarily adapted to very small-scale societies, and why these mechanisms are less than perfect in the modern world. This has implications for the design of social networking sites as well as mobile technology. He uses conventional behavioral and cognitive experimental approaches combined with network analysis, agent-based modeling, comparative studies of primate brain evolution, neuroimaging, and neuroendocrinology to explore explicit and implicit processes at both the dyadic and the group level. Now, in 1994, Professor Dunbar was appointed at eminent chair in psychology at the University of Liverpool. In 1998, he was elected fellow of the British Academy. And in 2015, he received the Huxley Memorial Medal given by the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland. Now, let me show you some of his work. Here you can see the titles, the covers of some of the books written by Professor Dunbar. I will read you just the titles: Grooming, Gossip, and the Evolution of Language. And the other one is The Human Story, A New History of Mankind's Evolution. The Trouble with Science, that's a very interesting evolutionary approach to the study of science. The Science of Love, a Pelican Introduction to Human Evolution, Our Brains and Behavior, Human Evolution, Evolution, What Everyone Needs to Know, Friends, Understanding the Power of Our Most Important Relationships, and How Religion Evolved and Why It Endures. Now, right. Okay, Robin, I will ask you the question that we ask all our guests. In what way has the Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection been relevant to your research? And in what way do you think is relevant to understanding human beings and to understand human evolution?
I guess the simple answer to the first part of that question is that everything I do is really framed within a Darwinian framework, in that I'm asking, how does a behavior or a trait, whether it's a cultural trait or an anatomical trait, allow individuals to maximize their contribution to future generations, which effectively is their Darwinian fitness. And that's kind of, if you like, just a guiding principle. That it provides a very strong quantitative basis for examining, if you like, the value of different behaviors from the point of view of the individual. At the end of the day, we live in a Darwinian world. It has been dominated by, or at least the biological world has been dominated by evolution. Of course, the cosmos evolves too, the universe evolves, according to the cosmologists, but that's a slightly different sense of evolution. That's much more kind of an unfolding of the state of the universe as a consequence of things that are going on within it, as it were, the formation and death of stars and so on. In that sense, we can see that applying to humans and other animals, but the added incentive, if you like, in the case of the biological world is the fact that we have a very strong theory in Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, combined with Mendel's theory of genetics, that allow us to explore the real benefits of organisms' behavior and how they try to solve the problem. So the central assumption is that organisms will evolve towards more and more efficient ways of solving their problems of survival and successful reproduction. Unless, of course, they get into a non-challenging environment. So some species that live in the deep oceans, the environment can change. So they don't change over very, very long periods of time, like the sharks, for example. But those of us who live on the surface of the Earth face constant climatic changes and environmental changes, and that causes animals to have to change their adaptive plans, if you like. Of course, they're not doing this consciously. This is an unconscious process going on at the genetic level, except until we get to kind of very smart species like many mammals, some birds, maybe certainly the primates, and of course humans, who do some thinking in there about what they would be the best thing to do.
Mhm.
Should I go and have a glass of wine now, or should I talk to you? This is an evolutionary dilemma, if we like, and different consequences will follow from my fitness. So I make the judgment that I'm much better off talking to you.
Right. Good. Your name has become, your surname has become very famous because it is associated with this Dunbar number, okay? The number that relates size of the brain with size of the social group, and also the evolution of language. I mean, tell us about how did you come across this number, and why is that number so important to understanding humans and human evolution?
The origin of the number really goes back to a time when I was trying to understand the constraints on group size in primates, in particular monkeys and apes. And at that time, what was then called the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis had just been proposed. So that proposed that primates have big brains because they live in very complex societies, essentially. So I thought we could test that by looking at the size of different species social groups and see if that correlated with either the whole brain or particular parts of the brain. And when I did that, what I found was really a very good relationship between social group size and relative neocortex size. So the proportion of the brain that's devoted to neocortex. And the neocortex is the kind of thinking part of the brain, if you like, and it's also the part of the brain that's exploded in size in the course of primate evolution. And having got that relationship, I was then prompted to ask, well, what would it predict for humans? And since there were human brains in the brain database I had, I simply plugged human brains into the equation for primate group size against brain size, and that predicted a group size of about 150, which seemed at the time very small to me, because obviously we live in, at least in the more developed societies in the world, we live in these very big cities. But of course, there are small scale societies still with us, and we have historically spent almost our entire career as a species in very small scale hunter-gatherer type societies. But anyway, it prompted me to go away and look to see if there was evidence for a group size of this kind. At some level, I didn't really know what kind of group to look at. So I'd looked at the hunter-gatherer literature and simply asked, what are the numbers that the ethnographers, the anthropologists have come up with for different grouping types? And is there a size that fits this value of 150? And it turned out to be not the band, which is what everybody thinks is the basic unit for hunter-gatherers. That's the living group, which is really an ecological unit, a camping group, if you like. But the next bigger grouping, which I came to call a clan in the end, it's a group of bands that essentially share a common ranging area and have close relationships with each other. And again, the tribes, which are the kind of really final layer in the sequence of human nested grouping layers, tribes are much, much bigger, an order of magnitude bigger. So it was something about this particular grouping level, which seemed to occur in all hunter-gatherer societies, that mapped onto this figure of 150. And then we kept finding it in different contexts in contemporary humans. So the size of your friendship and family circles, if you ask people to write down all the people they had meaningful relationships with. We found it in the size of telephone calling logs, if you like, looking up to see how many different people were called in the course of, say, a year. They had reciprocated calls, so they called each other back at least once. So that helped us exclude people like your doctor, who doesn't very often call you, and free numbers and all these other kind of things we have on our phones. If you just look at ones that resemble relationships and that they're two-way callings, then you come up with a number close to 150, and then they turn up all over the place. So my favorite examples are the great national census that the Normans did when they conquered England. So they carried out a massive census to see how much tax they could get out of these Saxon peasants. And they counted everything except people, but the detail that they give us, the number of houses and so on, has allowed the historians to calculate the average size of villages. And the average size of villages in the Domesday Book, which covers the whole of England and Wales, in 1087 AD, so 1,000 years ago, was almost exactly 150. And there's a very, very nice Italian grazing association data set. So these are really villages in the Italian Alps, where they're trying to manage the number of cattle and sheep and goats that the village grazes. So they keep a list of all the members of the village, as it were, and that spans. Some economists found these data, but it spans a period of 800 years, from about 600 years, from about 1250 AD up to about 1850, and the average size across that time is 145. Right. Villages increase and increase. They split, fission, and you get two smaller villages, and they increase again. The average size is almost exactly 145. And then the biggest data set we know is a Facebook data set, which
Right, yes.
was published about 10 years ago, which they looked at 61 million Facebook pages. And the average number of friends on Facebook was 149. So
Good.
that is so close to 150. I can retire.
Yeah. So there is therefore this connection between the size of the neocortex and the social group.
Yes.
So, but what would be the cause and what would be the consequence? I mean, do you think that we have this social group because we have this brain, the size of this brain, or the opposite? Or
it depends on which way down the telescope you look. So if
Right.
we look now, let's say at your social world, your personal social world, it's your brain that puts a constraint on the number of family and friend relationships you can have. Right. But if you're looking at in evolutionary time, historical time, then of course what's happening is the other way around. The need to increase group size in order to solve challenges in the environment, whether it's predators, which is primarily the main reason for living in groups in mammals and birds generally, or whether it's raiding by people in the next door valley or something like that, such as you might get in humans or even in chimpanzees, then it's this ecological pressure to increase group size, which is then, if you like, forcing the species to evolve a larger brain to make that possible. But it means that the two variables are in very, very tight co-evolutionary connection, as it were. You can't increase group size if you don't increase brain size, because your groups will become incoherent. And this really goes back to the question of what it is that the brain is doing. Why do you get this limit on the size of group you can manage imposed by the brain? And the answer is, from a lot of neuroimaging studies, brain imaging studies that we and other people have done, and a lot of cognitive experiments, that it has to do with the ability to manage information about relationships, not necessarily so much about individuals. There's not a memory problem about all the people that I know, that I can remember their birthdays, that I can remember which one owes me money for some job done or whatever it may be like that. It's not a memory problem per se, but the ability to manage information about the relationships at second and third and fourth party levels. So I have to be able to think, if I'm rude to you, which of course I would never be, but if I'm rude to you, will that upset your friend who's sitting next door? And then the two of you will come and beat me up, and I'm kind of go, oh, this is 2-1. This is a bad ratio for winning fights. I'd say it's those kind of information processing that really is key to it. And then in addition, there seem to be two key cognitive processes which are very, very important in managing this very complex social world that we live in, and indeed primates live in, which are very expensive for the brain to run. So they both depend on very large, even within, we can show within humans that people who have bigger neocortices or bigger subunits within the neocortex that handle this stuff will have better skills in these domains. And these domains are mentalizing, which is the ability to understand other people's mind states. So it's my ability to understand your intentions. So if you run past me in the street and you kick sand in my face, when you do that, I can step back from that immediate event and say, did Carlos deliberately do that, or was it an accident? Because which is the correct answer changes how I should behave. Obviously, if you deliberately did it, then I must go and fight you. But if you did it by accident, I must go, oh, not Carlos again. He's always kicking sand when he runs. So that becomes very important. And the number of people that you can manage at the same time, their mind states, is determined by the size of the core processing units within the neocortex, and have imposed limits on things like the size of conversations we have. And we can see this very nicely illustrated, for example, in Shakespeare's plays, and I'm sure in every great Spanish dramatist since 1000 AD, we can see exactly the same effect, that when they're very, very good at handling the number of speaking parts on the stage at the time so that they don't overtax the audience's processing capacity in terms of mentalizing.
Right.
And then the other, and you can just see it in Shakespeare. He's so clever in the way he does it. You know, if they're talking about Hamlet's mind stage off the, you know, if Hamlet's friends are talking about Hamlet's mind state, and why is he having all these problems with his father, the ghost of his father, and Hamlet is not on the stage but somewhere else, they're just discussing him, then he only has 3 people on the stage. If they're discussing somebody's mind state who is there in the conversation, then Shakespeare will have 4 people on the stage. So he's very carefully manipulating the load on the audience. But the other key cognitive ability is essentially self-control, and that goes along with this mentalizing capacity, because self-control allows me not to go and beat you up when you run past kicking sand in my face when I know it's an accident, because that would have very bad consequences for our friendship afterwards. And therefore for the stability of the group, right? So these are what I call the skills of diplomacy,
right?
Which are conspicuously absent at the moment, I may say,
right,
on the international stage, but are very, very important to managing societies, small-scale societies as well as large-scale societies, and maintaining the coherence and of the community, keeping the community together.
Good, because in this way one of the mysteries, I'd say, of human evolution is precisely the size of our brain.
Yes,
our
of course.
brain is very big, and it's very expensive, and it's a very expensive organ.
Yes.
And you would say then that we have these big brains because we needed to have these social groups.
Very big groups, yes.
Right.
And that's a consequence of having to live in relatively, or environments that are relatively high predator risk. So more open environments. You can see brain size really starting to increase very rapidly with the appearance of the genus Homo, which effectively is once they became more nomadic and occupied much more open kinds of environments. So if you look at the kind of environments the Australopithecines lived in, they were much more wooded, not necessarily forests, but riverine forests maybe, but they were fairly heavily wooded. So there are plenty of trees for animals to escape into to avoid predators when they needed to. And therefore their brain sizes remained within the great ape range. It didn't really increase very much, and their group sizes would have been similar to those of chimpanzees. But once you get the appearance of Homo, and they're moving out into the more open habitats and moving much further, becoming more nomadic, then their only defense is each other. So there seems to be pressure to increase group size in that context. You can see this with contemporary primates, baboons. Baboons live in bigger groups in habitats that are more open and have fewer trees to act as refuges from predators, so that the group becomes the only way of protecting the individuals from being caught by predators. So it's kind of environmentally driven. I think much later, probably, sort of in post the end of the last ice age, in Neolithic times, then the source of the environmental problem seems to switch to raiding by other humans.
Right.
So, these dreadful people in the valley next door,
Right.
who keep coming and raiding our camps and so on. And that seems to demand bigger and bigger groups. And I think that's why you see settlement going on in the Neolithic, and a very rapid increase then once the people had settled in villages and, if you like, got used to living together in a village. You get this very rapid increase in the Middle East, in particular, in village size. So you get towns and cities and city-states and so on, all within a few thousand years. I think it's just pressure from the neighbors.
That's right. And then, well, closely related to this is the issue of the evolution of language as well, because
Yes.
Primates keep their social relations by grooming, but it seems that this big social group cannot be kept just by grooming. So
that has been my argument, yes, and because if you look at the time budget requirements for social grooming is the way primates bond their social groups, and it's a purely pharmacological mechanism that the leafing through the fur triggers the endorphin system in the brain, and the endorphin system in the brain makes you feel very bonded to the individuals you do it with. But the problem is grooming. We still do it.
that's right.
But we don't often think about it because it's going on beneath what I call the consciousness horizon. But when we're engaged in conversation amongst our friends and family, anyway, we don't do this with strangers. Even in Spain, you don't do this with strangers. But with family and friends, you're constantly patting them on the shoulder and giving them a hug, and tapping their knee and stroking their arm and all these kind of things, which we do. And it's producing the same effect. But the limit on that, the limit on the number of people, we've done this with census data, from survey data from all around Europe and also Japan. Where are people willing to touch other people or be touched by other people? Right. And the answer is the limit on who you're happy to touch produces a group of about the same size as the maximum group sizes you find in primates, which is about 50 people. So this is sort of close family and friends, really. And that creates a problem, because if you want to have a bigger group, how do you bond a bigger group using this mechanism? And the answer is, well, you can't with touch because of the intimacy of touch. And also you can only stroke one person at a time. So I always offer a challenge on this, if you don't believe me, and that is, if go to the back row of the cinema and try and cuddle with two people at the same time. Right? And I can bet you any amount of good Spanish wine, in fact, a whole vineyard of good Spanish wine, that within 10 minutes, one of them will have left and be very cross because you've not been paying them enough attention. That's right. It's a very kind of intimate thing, and we can only do it, primates typically only do it one-to-one. So the only way of solving this problem is to increase the number of people you groom with, which means you have to find a way of triggering the system, the brain system, the neural system that underpins the endorphins, without physically touching people. It turns out that a lot of the things we do socially actually do this. And the main group of these, which I call our social toolkit, are laughter, singing, dancing, the rituals of religion, feasting together, and storytelling. And if you kind of try to work out the time costs involved to bond groups of different sizes, it's clear that probably the laughter comes in earliest, and we share that with the great apes anyway. and indeed it's the only one which is kind of genetically instilled, if you like. In other words, it's under much less conscious control than any of these other activities. So if people in your conversation group laugh, you laugh. You can't help it. You don't know why, because you weren't listening, so you didn't hear the joke. But if everybody else laughs, you have to laugh. It's kind of like a form of chorusing. But the other 5 activities, singing, dancing, religion, feasting, storytelling, are all things which have come in very recently. Basically, I think since probably singing and dancing and music making, I think from the analyses we've done, would have come in with the appearance of archaic humans, so the Heidelberg folk, the Neanderthals, and so on. But the other 3, religion, feasting, and storytelling, really depend on fully developed human language. And fully developed human language, as we have it now, really only seems to appear with anatomically modern humans, from the mentalizing capacities that we have, which we can predict for fossils from their brain sizes, and indeed the anatomical components of things like the voicing and hearing systems, all point to what you might think of as singing appearing with the archaic humans. I'm happy if they have some language. I don't doubt that, but I don't think language arrived as we have it now, suddenly by a miracle. But it must have come in stages. So I'm happy for the archaic humans to have had some kind of competent language skills, but they weren't as sophisticated as ours. Right. So the difference really I kind of put on is they were operating at about one level, mentalizing level below what we can do as normal adults, and this would dramatically have affected the quality of the jokes. So their ability would have been about the same as young to mid-teenage humans, which means they can tell jokes, but they're the jokes of 14-year-olds, mostly lavatory humor. Well, lavatory humor is very funny if you like that kind of thing, but when you get to be 20 or 25, it becomes less sophisticated, and there are more sophisticated things you can do. And by the same token, the quality of their stories would not have been so complex and dramatic and engaging. So language at that point starts to play a really important role. And I think those things that depend on high language abilities, complex language abilities, and the abilities to formulate very complex thoughts in terms of, let's say, the number of people in an event when we're describing some story, we would only have seen these highly developed skills in anatomically modern humans, so just in our species. But what it does is certainly change the dynamics and size of the groups that you can maintain, because one of the things that and what they actually do, and what's interesting about these 6 bits of the social toolkit, is actually all of them work quite well for increasing the size of the group you bond. They all trigger the endorphin system. They all create this increased sense of bonding with us. But some of them really scale up extraordinarily well. So singing is particularly good. Laughter is not. It's very limited in its range. Laughter groups tend to be very, very small and intimate, about conversation group size. But singing groups can be certainly several hundred people, and there is a spectacular picture of a choir of 27,000 people in a football stadium. Of course, it's associated with some religion or other, but you know, it's possible to create a kind of degree of synchrony through music, which allows very large numbers of people to be bonded. And I guess we know this, you know, sort of if you're a football fan, because much of your time at the football game is spent not watching the football, apparently, but singing the club song or the national song or whatever it may be, depending on, you know, if it's a local game or an international game. But also, once we get into storytelling capacities, then I think it becomes very interesting, because we can create a kind of culture of folk tales, you know, not so much instructions of how we do things, but just kind of passing information on about how it is we, in our village, as it were, you know, do things this way, and those people over there, you know, I mean, they do dreadful things. they put their sugar in the tea first before they put the tea in, which is clearly a terrible, terrible thing to do. So we can have these kind of very subtle ways of signaling our tribal membership on a very large scale. I think that's what allows us to create, in small scale societies, allow people, in, even though they're not living together, to create tribes, because you can flag up very quickly whether somebody is a member of your tribe or not, because as soon as they open their mouth, they're speaking with the wrong dialect.
Right.
Et cetera, et cetera. And of course, they don't know your folk tales, and they don't know your explanations for why the moon goes across the sky in the night, and all these kind of things that we tell each other around the campfire, as it were. But of course, then that provides you with an opportunity for creating much bigger mega communities, in the sense of city states and nation states, because, you know, I can tell you all about our dramatic history as a country, and how we defeated our enemies 1,000 years ago, and all these kind of wonderful stories which we use, and at the same time, you know, we can bring into play these other components of the thing, because we could have a national anthem, and we can, you know, have a flag that represents us and represents our mega community, if you like. And all these things are kind of natural outgrowths of these original capacities. It's extrapolating capacities that were originally evolved to handle ethnographic size small scale societies, but most of which can be upscaled very, very effectively. And particularly so religion, of course, as we know, you know, you can have religions that have many millions of adherents, tens of millions of adherents.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'll ask you about religion later, because you have done also research on religion. But this reminds me of an interview we had some time ago with Stephen Mython, and as you know, he has this theory of the singing Neanderthals.
Yes.
That the singing was was begun, the beginning of language. Actually.
Well, I think that's true, because all the anatomical markers that change with the appearance of archaic humans are largely to do with breath control, which is very important with singing, and secondarily so with conversation, with speech, if you like, but extremely important for singing. That and anatomical markers for hearing capacity as well, and all these change at the same time, from being primate-like to being modern human-like around that time. And I suspect that suggests that there was, well, if you like, my hypothesis is that in early Homo, so Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, etc., they were using laughter as a chorus, as a form of chorusing for bonding small-scale groups. because their groups are bigger than, for sure, bigger than chimpanzee groups and Australopithecine groups, but not as big as the groups you'd find in archaic humans. But that they then supplemented that as group size became necessary to increase group size further with the evolution of archaic humans. They supplemented laughter with what's essentially an extension of laughter, because laughter depends on breath control as well, but albeit in a different way. But it's a sort of natural stepping stone into producing wordless singing. So it's a singing without words. I mean, you can put words in, but you don't have to, you know. And we still don't. I mean, we have, you know, well, apparently with modern music, pop music, Carlos, you don't need to hear the words at all. You know, I mean, I probably, like you, I grew up in a generation when it was important to hear the words in a song.
Right.
Now all you need is white noise.
That's right. So one of the things that anthropologists have been discussing for a long time is what is the distinctive characteristic of humans. So what makes humans different from other species? Would you say it is precisely language? It's our
I would say even more, it's storytelling.
Storytelling, yeah.
Right. That without storytelling, we would not be able to maintain such big groups as we did as a species, as hunter-gatherers. So we would not be able to create tribes beyond the level of clans or local communities. And we certainly wouldn't be able to create mega communities in the sense of historical city-states or even nation states now. It's all about being able to, or indeed religions on the scale that we have now.
Right.
So it really is all about storytelling. That depends on language, of course, but I think it's an extrapolation of the functions of language, that language initially would have arisen for basically coordination in the hunting group context, not necessarily for the purposes of hunting, but just to keep the band together. But of course, you know, making decisions, you know, in the case of the women, you know, shall we go gathering, and shall we go and gather at that grove of trees down by the lake, or a different grove of trees? For the men, presumably the equivalent to be coordinating hunting, although by and large most hunting in hunter-gatherers is done with very few people, because what you don't want is lots of noisy idiots disturbing your prey when you're trying to keep up on them. So, but even so, you know, there's lots of things people need to talk about in the context of hunter-gatherer bands and camp groups that have to do with arrangements for when they change a campsite, to try and keep the group bonded together, and now we're into storytelling again. So although, you know, language probably had much more to do with me explaining who I am and what I like and what I don't like to you, in order to facilitate the formation of friendships at the personal level. Originally, its information transfer capacities make it very, very good for transferring information on a larger scale that are related to, you know, how we bond very large communities. So tribes, for example, you know, we all wear the same clothes. We all have the same haircut, not just because we copy each other, but because I tell you it's really good to do it this way, Carlos.
That's right.
It's really cool. So I think the functions of language have almost certainly changed, you know, over relatively recent evolutionary history since.
And closely related to language, I mean, another characteristic that is normally seen as distinctive of humans is culture, is this kind of shared social knowledge. But non-human animals have a kind of culture. So How would you
Yeah,
draw the distinction between human
yeah.
and non-human culture?
To be fair, I think the criteria for culture in non-human species has much more to do with local problem solving, as it were, what's good to eat or what's not good to eat, and the transfer of information between individuals at that level. At least, certainly, that's where all the research has been done, but that's perhaps dependent on the fact that it's difficult to do experiments on mind states in animals. But I think once you have language, it really changes the possibilities for culture, because not only can you copy my extremely clever hunting style, for example, but we can have a discussion now about how good they are, and then we can have a further discussion about how our hunting styles are much better than those crazy guys who live in the next door valley, because, you know, the best they can do is catch some hens. You know, we can get mammoths.
That's right.
So you know, and of course this leads very quickly into, I think, fiction, and so we're talking about culture with a big C now. Seriously,
Right.
I think that's, you know, whatever animals do is very impressive, but it is not in the same league as what humans do with culture in the sense we normally mean culture, which has obviously to do with things like drama and fictional storytelling, the design of pottery or paintings or religious rituals or dances or music, all these things that, you know, are unique to humans, but they're unique to humans in the sense that they are particularly specific to the bonding of very large social groups.
Right. Right. Now, and talking about culture, as you know, in the social sciences, there is a tradition of criticism against evolutionary psychology. And they say that, well, evolutionary psychologists, they produce these just so stories to explain human behavior, and they normally ignore culture, the relevance of culture. So how would you respond to this criticism?
The answer is, of course, the criticism is not completely invalid. I mean, there is a tendency, or has been a tendency in the past, certainly, for people to get very carried away and invent just so stories to explain why we do a certain kind of behavior or whatever it may be. But I think, you know, it is perfectly possible to test hypotheses in the context of evolutionary psychology. Generally, you just have to remember that there are two different ways to go here, which depend on what I sometimes call Dobzhansky's dictum, which was observation the great evolutionary biologist Theodore Dobzhansky made way back in the 50s. And he said, look, when biologists discuss adaptations and seek to prove adaptations, they can actually be talking about two completely separate ways of doing it. One is, in effect, to count the efficiency with which a behavior or trait, if it's an anatomical trait, allows individuals to reproduce. And this is the kind of baby counting method of usually referred to as behavioral ecology now. And you know, we can do that even with humans. You know, we've done a lot of studies with historical demography data, for example, or historical data from the Icelandic Vikings, using their family sagas, which contain beautiful records of great detail of what went on in communities 1,000 years ago. And so that's one way of doing it. But the other way of doing it is what he called the adaptation by design. So you can look at the property of some trait or other and ask, is it well suited to produce the effect which we hypothesize was the adaptive function for it. And that's the classic method of looking at the eye and saying, well, it's if you take the eye to pieces, you can see it's well designed for allowing animals to see. And I guess a lot of evolutionary psychology is of the second kind, because what they're interested in is universal things that are true of all humans. So they're mainly interested in the psychology and therefore the cognition. So they're looking at cognitive abilities, which they are, for all practical purposes, will be the same in every human, every part of the world and throughout history. They haven't changed that much. And you're kind of looking to see how efficient those mechanisms work. Of course, you can run perfectly good cognitive experiments. Psychologists do that all the time. The baby counting method is really looking at let me rephrase that and say the kind of adaptation by design method is really looking at evolution that happened in the past. Right, and you're trying to explain why it came to be that way. The baby counting method is looking at evolution happening now, right now.
Right.
I can go out and I can count the number of babies you've produced, Carlos, and figure out your fitness, your genetic fitness, and your contribution to future generations, or whatever that might have been or not been, those two ways of doing it are equally valid biologically. Both of them produce perfectly good evolutionary or perfectly good hypothesis testing capacities. We can test hypotheses. And then, of course, comparative analysis has been very important in the course of the development of evolutionary theory since Darwin, who really more than anybody else promoted the comparative method. Although I hasten to say the comparative method goes back to Aristotle. He was the first person to use it in trying to understand differences between animal species way, way, way back. We have something to thank the Greeks for.
Right. Yeah.
But there are now very powerful statistical tools for undertaking comparative methods studies to look at the evolution of different capacities or different traits, anatomical traits, whatever it may be. I guess the problem we have with humans is there's only one of us.
Right.
And this is a great shame that we still don't have some Neanderthals or Heidelberg people or Denisovans, right, or even some Homo erectus walking around that we can do experiments with, cognitive experiments with, and see how they compare. It's a bit limiting. So, of course, there's lots of things you can do with anatomy. We can measure brain size in fossils, brain size in humans, length of bones, all these kind of things that paleoanthropologists have done for many, many decades, and we can learn something. So it's not completely impossible, but it doesn't help only to have one species left.
That's right. That's right. And what do you think about, say, the possibility of applying Darwinian theory precisely to study the evolution of culture? I mean, do you think that cultures evolve following the Darwinian principles, or how do you?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. And of course, that's exactly what people like Boyd and Richardson have done in developing mathematical theories based on the standard mathematics of genetic evolution for cultural elements. This is mainly about the efficiency of copying as much as anything. The big argument has always been whether culture can have a life of its own. So yes, we can define a measure of cultural fitness that's similar to the measure for biological fitness, genetic fitness. We measure biological fitness as the number of descendants you leave in future generations. we can define cultural fitness in terms of the number of copies of some new cultural thing which appears in future generations. So it's exactly identical. The question has always been, is it possible for cultural evolution to overwhelm biological evolution, because cultural evolution proceeds very fast,
right?
Whereas biological evolution, particularly in the species that have culture, and obviously especially humans, proceeds very slow. It takes a minimum of 1,000 years to get even a small change in genetic fitness in humans. Whereas clearly culture can change in a matter of a few years in some cases. Right. Although that said, it is astonishing how stable cultural transmission is. Actually, the speed of change in cultural evolution is sometimes a lot slower than anatomical evolution. But aside from that, the issue is it possible for cultural memes, if you like, to wipe out a species because it replicates faster than the animals can themselves change genetically. So this is the famous meme for suicide dilemma. Is it possible for a meme for suicide to become so popular that it wipes out the whole species? Or is, as the saying goes, is culture on a genetic leash? So ultimately, there's a backstop beyond which it's never possible for culture to push the organism, because the organism will always be concerned about its biological reproduction. And I guess the reality is that there is a biological leash on culture. Culture is very free to go. A lot will depend. The view I take is how free the cultural system is will depend on what the consequences are in the real world for the organism of a cultural practice or belief.
Right.
So, if I produce a cultural meme about God, which requires me to do some sacrifices or something every week, or engage in some religious ritual every week, this is probably not too big a problem. It can go, it can be quite speculative, and two different populations can go in completely different ways. You can have well, I guess you can have your good Catholic God and I can have my good Protestant God. Is the modern example of this, and we don't have to agree at all, because actually it doesn't have major consequences for our everyday lives. But there's certain things like, and as the example I always cite is the observation by the Kung San Bushmen from southern Africa, who say there is no point in going into the lion's den just to check to see whether the lion's cub's eyes are open at birth or not. It's a very stupid thing to do. You'll get eaten immediately. So there, there's a cultural meme, if you like, in the form of a guide to behavior, which says just don't do it. That's not very good for you, and it isn't very good for you. So presumably, there have been experiences where some people have tried to check out whether lion cubs have their eyes open or not, and they have never emerged from the cave again.
That's right.
But I guess a lot of cultural things are free to vary immensely, because their primary purpose, the focus of the kind of Boyd Richardson perspective, a lot of the cultural perspective has in the end been on things which are kind of useful.
Right.
right? What should you plant in different places, and when should you plant them, and how do I make a sharper sword or a better bow, cooked differently or something like that. But all those things which most of our culture with a big C are about, so fiction, storytelling, dances, singing, whatever, making statues, paintings, these have no immediate practical value.
Right.
Their value is for bonding the large-scale tribal level community, right? So that I can recognize when I come meet you in the dark forest on the little forest track, and I see you 100 yards away, and I don't know whether you're a friend or foe. I can see immediately from your hairstyle, the clothes you're wearing, the weapons you're carrying, that in fact you belong to my tribe.
Right.
And so I can breathe a great sigh of relief and come and give you a hug, Carlos. Whereas, if it's clear you're not a member of my tribe because you're wearing different clothes and have different weapons, I'd better run very fast.
Better run. Yeah. Let me ask you about another topic that you have been doing research on, and another characteristic of the human species as well, which is pair bonding.
Yes.
There is no pair bonding in our closest cousins, chimpanzees and bonobos, and there is pair bonding in all human societies. So
Yes.
what would be the origin of that? What would be the explanation?
The view I've come round to fairly recently, actually, so it's still not really been published in any detail, is that we have a problem. The problem has been known about for a long time. Terry Deakin drew attention to it in his book way back in the 1990s, his book on the evolution of language and in humans, and various biologists working on birds in particular have drawn attention to it. And this is the fact that if you have big groups, for example, big flocks of birds that all live together in a sandbank, as you have with, say, let's say, or a cliff face, many seabirds, for example, you've got a real problem with females going in and out, that they can be attacked by unpaired males. See this actually happening. And what they do is they only go in and out of the nesting colony from their own nest, as it were, to the outside world to go foraging as a pair very often.
Right.
It depends on particular context, but very often they go out as a pair. So the female is accompanied by a male who acts essentially as a bodyguard. So this is known as the bodyguard hypothesis. And there's some evidence that this is what happens in humans. So it kind of explains, or seems to explain, why you tend to get a stronger attachment by the female to the male than you do the other way around. That it's in the female's interest to have this bodyguard there as protection. But the real context in which this becomes important in primates is when you have very big groups. Right. So the two species of primates that have very large stable groups as opposed to unstable groups are the gelada and the hamadryas baboons, where you have a kind of basic group size, a band of sometimes certainly over 100 individuals, sometimes 200 or 300 individuals. What you get in these groups is harems forming within the band, as it were. So the females are then attached to a male who act as a bodyguard for them and keep nuisance males away from them.
Right.
So my sense is that this is kind of what happened with humans, because humans went through the same barrier, if you like, in terms of group size, as the hamadryas and gelada went through. So they have these big groups of several hundred individuals, the clan, the local community, and you've got lots of unpaired males kicking around who are just a nuisance. And all the ethnographic evidence on small-scale tribal societies, hunter-gatherer societies, indicates that the bigger the size of the band, the number of people who live together at any one time, the more stress and homicide you get going on. It's bad news living with other people, Carlos. You always end up fighting with them. But it basically, and it just highlights the fact that living in social groups, these stable bonded social groups, are the kinds we have uniquely in primates and humans, and just a handful of other species outside the primates. It's very, very demanding. That's why we have these big brains. It's how to manage the conflict and the stresses that occur. So what going back to the pair bonding, what the females are doing is just latching onto a male and going, you keep those thugs off me so that I can get on with what I want to do. And very often that produces harems, not least because you want as big a male as possible. So you don't want a small male, and there aren't that many big males. So you tend to get this is the what's called the polygamy threshold, which was developed in birds way back in the 1960s. Essentially, it's better to be the second wife of a very rich husband than the first wife of a very poor one. The equivalent in humans, and that same argument applies to the bodyguard hypothesis, because you want a big bodyguard. Of course, males vary in if you like, fighting ability that makes it preferable to be the second female of a good bodyguard than the first female of a weak bodyguard. So you end up with polygamy, and it's very conspicuous that if you look at our problem in some sense in the Christianized or the Abrahamic religionized world, is we're so deeply historically used to living in what are supposed to be monogamous relationships, marriages, that we think that is the norm. The answer is no, it's not the norm. If you look at across tribal societies as a whole, polygamy is much, much more common. Predominantly many wives attached to one male, very occasionally the other way around, but predominantly. So a few males have many wives and the rest have none, essentially. And so it looks suspiciously to me as though this is the same process going that we see in the Gelada and Hamadryas baboons for the same reason. It's what you effectively have to do when you live in very large social groups. Somehow you've got to have this social mechanism which allows you to reduce the stress loads that particularly the females will be under. It's mainly the females driving this.
What about biparental care? Because another hypothesis that was normally put forward is that the women need extra help to look after the children, and that would be the idea of pair bonding.
Yes, this is certainly true. The evidence is very strongly against that being the driver. That's a consequence of living in a pair bonded relationship rather than the cause of the pair bonded relationship. So if you look at the evolution of pair bonded monogamy in primates, the pair bonding always precedes biparental care, in evolutionary terms, and logically it does so too. So many years ago, I developed a game theory model of these processes, which showed that the biparental care component had to follow the formation of the pair bond, because otherwise it was too unstable. So it's a case of when you're living together in a pair bond, a monogamous pair bond, then there is an option on the male contributing in some way. It's fairly rare. There aren't many species where you do have genuine biparental care. It tends to be birds, which can do it easily. But the problem for mammals is we have this inconvenient business that only the female can be pregnant and only the female can lactate. So the male is kind of not a lot he can do. He can go and kill the odd bison maybe and bring it back as a present to his wife. But in hunter-gatherer societies, when males do that, they're forced to share the meat among the whole group, right? Yeah. Not just with your favorite wife, which suggests that it's not important. And I think if you look at, indeed, people who've looked at biparental care in child rearing in hunter-gatherer societies, most of the biparental care comes from the grandmother or the sisters of the mother. And the father, yes, he does a little bit, but it is possible for the father to change nappies. You know, he can do it, but either he's not very good at it, and the wife keeps saying, "Oh, for goodness sakes, let me do it." Or he just becomes lazy and sits by the fire telling stories, you know. But the reality is that it seems that, and there is a sense, if you think about it from a woman's point of view, you know, this process of child rearing, you know, starts with pregnancy or before pregnancy. And is, you know, of course, during, you know, the birthing process and stuff, you know, it really helps to have some help, somebody helping you, because it's such a difficult process for humans giving birth. And, you know, if you're a woman, it's much better to have another woman doing it because she actually understands what she's doing rather than, you know, some male who's, you know, really doesn't know what they're up to. So I kind of take the view that, you know, the pressure really goes back to, from the female's point of view, the whole process of child production and rearing and development and so on goes back to the fact that the women in human societies are behaving just like the females do in the highly social monkeys, to some extent the apes, but especially the highly social monkeys like baboons and macaques, where you have these very strong female-female coalitions, alliances, in which you're getting a lot of social and other kinds of support from your grooming partners. So, you know, if you look at the structure of grooming in primate social groups, they do not groom with everybody. The people they groom with is very, very limited. In fact, it's the same number of people we devote most of our social time to. It's this inner core of what we call with humans the shoulders to cry on, friends. The people who, you know, when your world falls apart, will drop everything to come and help you out of a sense of obligation and friendship. And it's the same with monkeys and apes. They have these very close bonded relationships that they spend almost all their social time with. All their grooming is devoted to these handful of, you know, 3, 4, maximum, absolute maximum 5 close grooming partners, which is exactly what we see in humans. And it's the strength of those relationships for primates that allows them to live in these big, bonded, stressful social groups, because it gives you protection against the other members of the group. But I think in humans, that friendship component is adapted to the child care side of things. And, you know, this is why you have these very distinct features in human friendships in women of a best friend forever. You know, men don't have them. They don't really understand. And in any case, well, you know, you've got your, you know, best male friend that you go drinking with. But what happens is when you get married, you stop going with them. You stay at home, right? So men have either a best friend or a romantic partner, but very rarely both together. Right? It's quite rare. It happens, but it's quite rare by comparison. Whereas women always have both a romantic partner and a best friend forever. platonic friend, and that platonic friend is nearly always another woman. And if you ask the people, we haven't worked on this particular part of it, but the social psychologists who've interviewed women about these things, best friendships, come back with the statement from the women: there is no point in discussing emotional issues with your man. Men don't understand emotional issues. It's absolutely crucial. If you're going to survive in this complicated social world we live in as humans, you have to have somebody to talk to about these things who understands what you're talking about. And the only people who can do that are women. And then very occasionally men. What's interesting is about 15% of best friends forever in our samples are men, not a woman, right? And you ask, who are these men that form these become the best friend forever of a woman? And they're either gay or they're very feminized men. So I think basically they're good listeners.
Right.
And they're not kind of romantic competitors, sexual competitors. But predominantly, the answer seems to be no. If you need that kind of deep emotional support, you've got to have somebody else who understands what that means, and don't bother asking a man.
Right. Robin, we're almost out of time, but let me ask you a last question about religion, about this book that you published.
Yes.
How can you summarize the best contribution that an evolutionary approach can do to understanding of religion?
Okay, so again, it's about social bonding or community bonding. It's how we form large bonded communities, and it just seems to be an extremely effective way of doing that. So we've looked at this the mechanisms involved in a number of different ways. We've actually done studies at church services looking at the endorphin production as a consequence of attending a church service. We did a variety of both Catholic and Protestant church services, different ones. We've done it we did it in some mosques that allowed us to go and do it. But unfortunately, we were just in the middle of that study and lockdown happened. So we had to stop. And after that, our group was disbanded, came to the end of its project, and we weren't able to finish it off. But we also went out to Brazil and did it with some of the Afro-Caribbean syncretic religions in Brazil. The particular one was the Umbanda religion. And we've done it with yoga, proper yoga, not yoga classes like you would go to at your gymnasium for exercise, but yoga philosophy and exercise training classes, and shown that in all these taking part in the ritual, the singing, the dancing, whatever it may be, it gives us a very strong endorphin lift and makes you feel bonded to the people you're doing it with. So people who go to, and I showed in a survey study later that people who go every day so people who are not religious have this close group of 5 best friends forever, if you like, these shoulders to cry on friends that you rely on, and you're very closely bonded to, you spend a lot of your time with. And the number 5 is just so consistent. Of course, there's some variation from individual to individual, but every sample we've studied over the years, it's always the average is 5. But the more often you go to your religious services, whatever that religion may be, it doesn't matter, the bigger you think that size of that circle is. And people who go every day or even twice a day, so they go to mass in the morning and they go to benediction in the evening, maybe, they think the whole of the congregation is in that class of best friends forever. They will have 80 people listed in there. And that's because they're feeling this intense bonding through the religious rituals. So we can look at a lot of these things. We can show that, sort of attending religion actually is very good for you in terms of health, mental health, as well as physical health. And that's because the effect of the endorphin system operating. So at approximate level, there are fitness benefits. At the ultimate level, there are these big effects due to bonding, the benefits you get from living in large bonded social groups, which is protection against the outside, the vagaries of the outside world.
Right. Well, that's all we had time for. I'm afraid we have to leave it here. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us. It has been a privilege and a honor and a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been great fun talking to you.
And thanks to Montse Martos for her technical assistance.
Indeed.
And, yeah. And thank you all for watching.